Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be with you on this Tuesday in the last week of March. I hope your week is going well so far. I am happy to be with you as always and happy to bring you another author interview. As I mentioned last week, we've had a lot of thrillers on the podcast, a lot of thriller authors, a lot of books that are in the thriller genre, and yet they're all so different. I mean, they all have their other kind of genres as well. They might be suspenseful thriller, they might be kind of scary, they might be they're all so different. I wish I had better words right now because I've just lost my train of thought on all the different types of thrillers that we've had. Today we get a thriller with a little bit of a paranormal element to it, which is something that we haven't had in the last little bit. So I'm excited to bring you an interview with author Carol Goodman about her new novel, The Night Visitors. And let me give you the description of this book. Alice gets off a bus in the middle of a snowstorm in Delphi, New York. She is fleeing an abusive relationship and desperate to protect Orrin, 10 years old, a major Star Wars fan and wise beyond his years. Though Alice is wary, Orrin bonds nearly instantly with Maddie, a social worker in her 50s who resides in an enormous run-down house in the middle of the woods. Maddie lives alone and is always available, and so she is the person the hotline always calls when they need a late-night pickup. And although, according to protocol, Maddie should take Alice and Orrin to a local shelter, instead she brings them home for the night. She has plenty of room, she says. What she doesn't say is that Orrin reminds her of her little brother, who died 30 years ago at the age of 10. But Maddie isn't the only one withholding elements of the truth. Alice is keeping her own secrets, and as the snowstorm worsens around them, each woman's past will prove itself unburied, stirring up threats both within and without. So that is the description of The Night Visitors by Carol Goodman, and it gives you an idea of the story, but there's so many different layers to this story. You get it told from both Maddie's and Alice's points of view, which gives you different insights into the story. Orrin, it's not told from Orrin's point of view, but he has a major role in this story, and you still sort of start to see the world through his eyes a little bit, at least how Maddie and Alice see him. And it just, every time you think you know where it's going, the story takes a little bit of a twist. On a slightly off subject note, I love that Orrin is a Star Wars fan, and that Maddie's brother was also a Star Wars fan 30 years ago. So you get the Star Wars that I grew up with, and then you get Orrin, who is a fan of the original Star Wars and the most recent iterations. So that's a lot of fun for me because I'm a big Star Wars nerd, and I love that that was a part of it. Like I said, there is that paranormal element to it. Not going to really tell you too much about that. We talk a little bit about it in the interview, so you'll have to listen to that. Just so interesting. There's so many assumptions that go on when Maddie and Alice meet each other. They both, as we all do, make assumptions, kind of form their opinions of the other right away based on just first impressions. And as they get to know each other through a variety of circumstances, they start to have to revise those assumptions, as we all do. And sometimes they have to revise them in directions that they expected, and other times in not so expected directions. And for us as the reader as well, sometimes those directions are not as expected. It's definitely a page turner. It is got its creepy elements, but it didn't like give me nightmares, which I appreciate. If you want a book that will give you nightmares, maybe this isn't the book for you, but I really appreciate a book that creeps me out but does not give me nightmares. So this was the perfect balance of that. I do have copies of this book to give away, so stay tuned until the end of the episode to find out how to win a copy of The Night Visitors by Carol Goodman. In the meantime, we are going to turn now to Carol so that she can tell us more about this book and what went into writing it and all of those other wonderful things that writers talk about in the process of writing their books. So let's turn now to my interview with Carol Goodman, author of The Night Visitors.
Hi, Carol. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. It's great to be here.
It is wonderful to have you here. We are going to talk about your new book, The Night Visitors. Before we talk about the book, though, I would love for my listeners to get to know you just a little bit. So if you could share just a little something about yourself and your life.
Okay. Well, I'm a writer. That's probably the main thing about my life. I've been writing since I was 9, and I'm also a teacher. I teach writing and literature at the State University in New York part-time, and I live in the Hudson Valley, where I've set a lot of my books. I was setting my books here before I moved here, and I have a daughter and a stepdaughter who are all grown up, and a poodle named Connie.
Oh, nice.
And a husband. Who's a poet. Don't want to forget him. Yeah.
Okay. Did you move to the Hudson Valley because you'd been setting your books there, or was that just a coincidence?
Kind of. I went to college in the Hudson Valley, and then I lived many other places. I grew up in Long Island, and then I lived out west in Texas and Colorado, came back to Long Island. But when I started writing the first book that would be published, Lake of Dead Languages, I didn't want to set it in Long Island because Long Island felt very crowded. But the Hudson Valley felt like it was a place where the Hudson Valley, and I include the Adirondacks because the Hudson, the river goes up that far. I felt like it was a terrain. It's a beautiful terrain. It has a lot of history in it. And it also has little pockets of mystery, I would say, where I felt like I could set my fictional places. So I was writing about it and visiting, and I dreamed of someday moving here. And then when my daughter graduated high school, I was able to realize that dream. So I came up and moved here about 9 years ago now.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk about The Night Visitors. Can you give us a brief overview of the story?
Okay, so it starts with, it's told from the point of view of two women, Alice and Maddie, and it starts with Alice is on a bus traveling into the Catskills on a snowy night, and she has a 10-year-old boy with her, Orrin, and we know she's fleeing something. We know something bad has happened, and she is trying to get Orrin and her to a place of safety. She calls up a crisis hotline. Orrin sees a ad in a bus stop for a place called Sanctuary, and she calls them for help. And she gets directed to a woman named Maddie, and so then we switch over to Maddie, and we get Maddie's point of view, and she gets this call to go pick up this woman who is fleeing a domestic violence situation and a 10-year-old boy. So she picks them up in the middle of the night, and she's supposed to take them to a shelter, but the boy begs her to take them home with her instead, and she's totally not supposed to do that. But the storm is really bad, and he convinces her by saying, your house is closer. And so she gives in and takes them to her house. And only later does she think, how did he know that my house was closer? So there's a little bit of mystery about the boy, Orrin, and what he knows. And then we have the situation where they're in this house and things are going to happen from there. And there's snow as well.
Yes, and oh man, there are so many things that I want to talk to you about, but they're all spoilers, so I can't.
After the recording.
Yeah, exactly. There's so much that happens in this book. But what was your inspiration for the book?
So I had a couple inspirations. I've written about women in trouble before, and it's something that I think I frequently go back to, women fleeing bad situations, bad marriages, bad situations. And it's something in my own life that I've had to do. So it's something that I've always felt close to. What specifically happened, though, in the fall of 2016 is a student came to me in one of my classes, and she was asking for an extension on a paper. And I get lots of reasons for that when students come to me, but hers was particularly devastating. She explained to me that she had left a abusive marriage and was living under an assumed name upstate, far away from her husband, with 2 children, and she had very few resources to survive. And so this story, it was, really painful to hear. Of course, I gave her the extension, but then I also thought, well, how can I help her more? I really didn't have any idea what I could do as a teacher to help her. So I asked around, and I found out about this place in Ulster County called Family of Woodstock. One of my colleagues told me about it and said they could help her. They deal with domestic violence situations. They have a shelter. So I went back to my student to tell her about this place, and she beat me to it. Somebody else had told her about it, and she said, wow, they were great. They've helped me find Section 8 housing. They've helped me find a job. They're giving me counseling. They're amazing. And I thought to myself, I thought 2 things. One, I thought, this topic still really means a lot to me, and I'm going to have to write about it again. And I also thought, I should volunteer at this place, Family of Woodstock. And I'll do that sometime when I have time. And like most things that we say, I'll do that when I have time. Probably I may not, I'm very busy. I teach, I write a book a year. I may never have gotten to it, but then the election happened in November of 2016, and the day after the election, I called them up and asked to volunteer. So I started working for Family of Woodstock. I did the training for the crisis hotline. And so the book really comes out of a combination of, thinking about this topic for a long time, but also doing the trainings for the crisis hotline and thinking about, what is available to women when they're leaving a situation like that. What kind of stories come out of that? And so that put Alice and Orrin on the bus, and the rest followed from there.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
I love that story. I love how she incorporated that story into this interview, but also how she really incorporated that experience, and it was something that she wanted to do, something that she was interested in, and how it really just came to fruition in the way that it did. We do have to take our first break of the podcast, but when we come back, we'll be talking more about Maddie and Alice as main characters of this book, The Night Visitors. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Carol Goodman. We are talking about her book, The Night Visitors. We were talking about the inspiration for the story before the break, and now we are going to turn our attention more towards the 2 main characters, Alice and Maddie, 2 very different main characters who maybe have more in common than they think, or at least they have things that will draw them together more than they anticipate. So let's get back to that interview with Carol Goodman.
So it is told from two points of view, from Maddie and Alice's points of view. What about those two characters do you think will resonate with readers?
Well, I really this is the first time I've ever done that, written back and forth, and I really love the differences in their point of view. Alice is fairly young. She's, we're not sure how young at first, but in her 20s. Maddie is late 50s, going on towards 60. And I've often wanted, I am 60 now, and I've often wanted to include a character of that age range, but I've also been told sometimes not to. So because I guess younger readers will identify with the younger character. So I think you have here both. You have Alice, who is a young woman who, doesn't know what, she's kind of desperate, and who of us have not felt like that in our 20s at some point, where we don't know where to turn or who to trust. And I think that resonates deeply with younger readers, and really with any of us who remember what that was like. And Maddie is somebody who has, lived longer and has more regret, and maybe feels a little bit more guarded about who she's going to trust. So both of these women, for different reasons, have issues with trusting each other. And we get to hear them back and forth as they're assessing who the other person is, and deciding, how much can I trust this person, especially as each of them begin to realize that the other one isn't entirely telling the truth about who they are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of assumptions on both parts when they first meet each other, which is, kind of how we all interact. Then we start to peel away those layers. Are there any, well, actually, you've kind of touched on this. Are there other autobiographical elements in the story or the characters that you haven't mentioned?
Well, let me think. I mean, there is, I did leave an abusive marriage when my daughter was 2. So I had to, pull up roots and go like 1,500 miles away. I felt at the time that I knew I was able to go home to my parents. And while it's not, really fun to move back in with your parents at 35 with a 2-year-old, I was very well aware of how lucky I was. So there's that element of it, and that's always made me extremely conscious of the issue of domestic violence and what women face if they are trying to leave. So there's that autobiographical element in it. And then really, I guess I created the autobiography of going to work for the family of Woodstock. So that's now part of my life. I had written most of the book before I actually started working there, because I did the training about midway through writing the book. And I actually I was glad of that, because I had to be really careful. The first thing I learned when I started working for them is everything I hear there is confidential. So I could not have used any material, anything that I hear on the phone or in the building I could not have used it. But I did ask them, I said, can I use procedure? Can I use what what you've taught me about, taking these calls and talking to people in crisis? And they said, yes, you could use that. So I do use that element in the book very strong. I think it makes the book stronger that I was able to use that.
Mm-hmm. And what kinds of research did you do for the book then?
Mm-hmm. Well, that was the main research, really. It was. I mean, I did read statistics on domestic violence, and actually, I've read some more on that as I've been writing some essays about the book. I've been reading more on domestic violence, but really going and doing the 60-hour training at Family, that was the research. And that's I've done a lot of strange, or I won't say strange, but I've done, research has taken me on many journeys for many books. This was one of the most intense, that, committing to the 60 hours training, and finding out how a crisis hotline works, how domestic violence shelters work, doing the reading for the training that involves learning about statistics about domestic violence, how to prepare to take a call from somebody who is in a dangerous situation. All of that was really the research that went into the book. I looked at some bus schedules as well. I had to know even though I make up the town Delphi that they go to.
Right.
I wanted it to be kind of, I looked at the they leave from Kingston and they travel west, so I was looking up, what are the bus routes and, how would they have gone? I'm trying to think if there was anything else I had to look. Oh, there's stuff about the constellations and the stars in it, as you know. So I had to read about some of the myths of the constellations, because Oren's into astrology and Maddie's brother had been into not astrology but astronomy, and so I did have to look up all these things about the stars, and I had little star charts over my desk while I was writing this, because that's one of the motifs in it. So there was that too.
Okay. Now, the book is a thriller, and there's plenty of action, but there's also a paranormal element to it, and I don't want to give too much away. So what made you decide to add the paranormal element into the book?
Yeah, well, and I wanted to say that I added it. It was always there. I think I knew it was there from the very beginning. Both when we have a little hint of it at the beginning, when Oren seems to know some things that we don't know how he knows them, and also Maddie, when she wakes up, when she gets the call, she thinks her dog is leaning against her leg, and then when she turns the light on, her dog's not there. So there's something in that house. I love ghost stories. I'm right now rereading for like the fourth time Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. I just it's a genre that I love, and I love the psychological possibility of a ghost story, what you can do with that, and I just love that little bit of a suggestion in a book that there might be something else happening here. I just think it's a really powerful metaphor for the fact that we're all haunted in some way by what has gone before. And as I wrote this book, I really started thinking about how it was a metaphor for trauma and what if the trauma in people's lives that haunts them, that stays with them. So that was just something that it felt integral to the book as I wrote it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
You've written multiple books. I would love for you to actually talk a little bit about some of your middle grade young adult books.
Oh, okay, thanks. So I wrote a series, the Blythewood series. That's a young adult series. And then one middle grade book called The Metropolitans. I really started that probably about, I guess I started around 2010, so about 8-9 years ago. I love fantasy, for one thing. That's a genre that I always appealed to me. And I love young adult books, and I love that mixture. I love fantasy and young adult. So I'd written about, I think, 7 adult thrillers by then, and I needed a break. I needed to do something different. I was afraid that I was maybe getting into a little bit of a pattern. And I just had started reading more and more fantasy, and my daughter was really into fantasy and young adult. And so I just had this idea for, first I wrote an adult fantasy book, the Demon Lover series. And then I just wanted to write more fantasy. And so I had this idea. I love books about boarding schools as well. And so I had this idea of a magical boarding school. Who would have thought of that? But that's a different one from I set mine in the Hudson Valley, and it's in 1911, and so it was a nice change for me to go to write that, and to just get into that world. And it was really fun talking. I think I wrote it at a time too when my daughter she went to college not far from here, actually 6 minutes from here, I have to say.
Oh, wow.
She and her friends used to come sit on my couch, and they were all interested in fantasy and young adult literature, and we'd all talk about it. And so it was fun to be writing that during that time when I was spending a lot of time with them. And so, yeah, it was great to write a trilogy. It was great to actually be able to stay in that world, to do all that world building and stay in it for 3 books. So yeah, it was just great fun. I love that time of life. I love teenagers. I taught middle school for a couple of years. I still teach college students who are just on just emerging from that. So it was just a fun thing to do, and I hope to do it again sometime. My daughter has written a young adult book that hasn't been published, but I keep nagging her to I'd like to co-write a book with her. But she hasn't agreed yet. So we'll see.
Yeah.
I definitely want to read Carol's young adult books as well as some of her other writings. So I'm excited to add those to my to-be-read list. We do have to take our second break of the podcast, but when we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about her young adult middle grade books, and then talking more about writing and reading and all of those fun things. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Carol Goodman about her new book, The Night Visitors. Before the break, we were talking about her young adult trilogy, and has a historical fiction aspect to it as well, which is fun. I love that. I love that genre. I love both genres, young adult and historical fiction. We are now going to talk a little bit more about her young adult middle grade book, and you'll find that I cannot say the name of one of my favorite books from childhood. So that was a great fail on my part. Let's get back to that interview.
The one that's not a trilogy, I was intrigued because it's described as from the mixed up files of Mrs. Now I can't talk. Meets the Alchemist, but the E.L. Konigsberg book, which is one of my favorites growing up. So I was like, I must read that.
The mixed up files of Mrs. Basley Frankwiller. Yes, one of my favorites growing up too, and one of my daughters. Yeah, that's the Metropolitan. So after I wrote the trilogy, I had this idea for a book set at the Metropolitan Museum that was a magic adventure book. And at first I proposed it as a YA, and my YA editor kindly informed me that it was a little too innocent for young adult. It was more like an adventure story. 4 kids on the eve of World War II have to find find some magical objects in the Metropolitan Museum in order to avert an attack on New York City. That was really fun, the research, because I love the Met, but I had to really spend more time in the Met and look at old maps of the Met and have them moving all around it. And it was a lot of fun to write. It was the hardest book I've ever written.
Wow. It
required so much research, and then the copy editor on that it was good. I thought I had done all the research really well, and she was like, but this street was not, did not run north-south in 1941.
Oh, wow.
I was like, oh my God, this library was not open. And so she made me, and I was glad at first I was like, oh, come on. And then I was like, you know what? All right, she's right. I'm going to make sure all those details are right. And I really dug deep in it and, got all the practical stuff is totally accurate. And then there's all the dragons and, and stuff like that. It was really
you can't
fun.
really fact check.
No, I think she would have if she could have. At the end of that, I got a note from my editor. She had gotten a note from the copy editor, and she said, tell Ms. Goodman this was one impressive revision.
Nice.
And I was like, yes.
Gold star. Good job.
I know. I wanted that on the blurb and on my gravestone. What impressive revision.
Nice. Are there any other of your writings that you would like to highlight?
Okay. I should have. So actually, no. Because I think I'm really focused on the night visitors right now. So
yeah.
I could have told you that before. I guess I'm really. There were other books I've written. I'm happy with them.
Right.
But I'm really the night visitors. I really am focused on that at this moment. I've been waiting for it to come out. I feel like I wrote it 2 years ago, although I guess it's only been about a year and a half. But I kind of feel like it's an important book. I feel like I really dug into something, and I guess because of using the material and working with family, I feel just like this is. I just want people to read this one. I really do. Mm-hmm. You can read all my other ones too, but to start with this one.
Great.
Because I'm happy with it. I'm happy with how it came out, and I'm happy with where it took me in my life as well as in my writing.
Yeah, great. Thank you. You mentioned at the beginning that you started writing when you were about 9, mm-hmm. and in your biography it says that you wrote a 90-page story
mm-hmm.
complete with illustrations.
Mm-hmm.
Well, do you still have that?
I do.
Nice.
It's falling apart. I looked at it the other day. Someone asked me to bring it to I was going to be on a panel in Florida, and they asked me to bring it. And I said, I do not trust taking this out of the house. It'll just fall to pieces. It's in a folder with the crayon pictures on it, and the pages as I was turning them over there. It's 51 years since I was 9 years old, so it's fairly delicate. But I still have it, and I still remember. And it really, that was the beginning. I mean, I remember very clearly writing it and feeling like just being taken out of my life entirely. It's as you may have whenever I've written about it, that it's about, we've heard of magical horses and the girl named Carol that lives with them, and no mention is ever made of Carol's family. So the idea of sort of escaping still being in it, but escaping your circumstances, and my family life there's something, terrible about it. But I think it was a way of living completely in this fantasy world. And I liked it so much that the teacher had to call a conference with my mother and say, it's great that Carol's really into this, but she does have to do her other work.
Oh, no.
I've since, I wrote really since then. I wrote poetry in high school. I took 2 breaks in my life. I did not write when I was in college, which has always been a little odd to me. I was a Latin major. But I kind of just stopped writing. I think I just didn't know where else to go with my writing at that point. And I remember the last semester of college, I started writing short stories. And then throughout my 20s, I wrote short stories. And then I stopped again when I went to graduate school, my first graduate school, going to get a teacher's degree. But after that, I started when I was graduating from getting my master's. I was writing my master's on young adult fiction, and I started a young adult book in my last semester, and that book didn't get published, but I wrote it, And from then on, I really kept writing,
Nice.
and didn't get published until late, I guess, really until I was 40. I mean, I started getting short stories published in my 30s, but I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I didn't always know how to do that.
Mm-hmm. Then, out of your unique experience and journey towards writing, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
Well, really that you just have to keep doing it. That you're a writer if you write. A lot of people think they can't call themselves a writer until they get published. Really, that's not what makes you a writer. It makes you a writer if you sit down and you write. And that, it's not going to be perfect the first time you put it down. You just have to keep doing it. You have to make room in your life for it. And, and tell people that I think you really have to claim your own space for it as well. That if it's important to you, that, this is what I write and this is the time I take for it. And, and read. And that's the other main advice. You really, I guess I should have mentioned right from the beginning in defining myself, writer, teacher, reader, you just have to read as much and as widely as you possibly can, and keep doing that. Mm-hmm. That's what really makes you a writer.
Yeah. So is that something that you try to impart to your students then, those key points?
Yeah, and I teach writing classes, but I also teach, composition, and I teach literature classes. Yeah, I think the main thing I am always really trying to get my students is to read and to love reading and to value it. And that's, to me, the most important thing that they can come away with from any of my classes is that they will enjoy reading. That is the main thing. And my writing classes, we also, I think we do a workshop. So I talk a lot about getting responses to your writing and what that's like, and that we don't always like it, and how to do that. And also that all writers feel discouraged at times, and that doesn't, that's just part of the process. Doesn't mean you're not a writer if you feel discouraged sometimes. Right.
You've touched a little bit on what you like to read when you read, but do you have favorite authors and genres?
I do read widely, so it's always a little hard to say. But I do have a favorite. Charlotte Bronte and the Jane Eyre is my favorite book. And, you can spend your whole life saying, I think I read it when I was 13. I just reread it for I think maybe the 5th time. But, there's always the fear like, oh, I've always said this is my favorite book. Is it still? And I reread it for a class I'm teaching it this semester. And I was like, yes, it is. And there were like things I had never seen in it. There were some problematic things I hadn't seen in it either, but I still came out of it going, yep, she's my favorite. So I love 19th century novels. I love Dickens. I love all the Brontes. I love Jane Austen as well. And then I love coming out of that whole 19th century and the Gothic. I've just recently reread Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I love that book. It's a much weirder book than I think any of us realize or remember it as. And then I think that all really leads into psychological suspense. So I love the mystery writers. I love Ruth Rendell, the British author, and I like Patricia Highsmith a lot. She's a little too prickly to love. And then a lot of what's being written. Let's see, the British author Sarah Waters, The Little Strangers, was one of my all-time favorite books. Now, and I've read that several times. Donna Tartt, Hannah French is a new Irish mystery writer or relatively new, that I think is doing fantastic stuff. And, current mystery writers, Laurie Rader Day, Lisa Unger, Sophie Hannah. I read widely in the genre of thriller, as well as, dipping back into the classics. often as, to remember what those books are like too. But, being a writing contemporary suspense, I like to keep track of what's being written in that field as well.
Right.
That's just a sampling. I didn't even go into the fantasy and all of that stuff. But I read widely.
Yes, nice. I know you have a website, so if you can tell us where we can find your website and also where people can find you on social media.
So carolgoodman.com, it's pretty simple, is my website. My Facebook page is also, I think, Carol Goodman Author. My Twitter is a little, I think if you look up Carol Goodman, you'll find my Twitter, but it's like C_Goodmania.
Ooh.
One of my daughter's friends, she set up my Twitter account, her friends from college were like sitting around the living room, showed me how to do it, and I was like, oh, what should my name be? And she came up with Goodmania.
I like it.
That's it. I have an Instagram account. I don't use it very much. I'm old. I try to be a little bit more with the times, but if you can probably find me on Instagram, and I should probably go there more often. I like it. It's hard to remember to do all this stuff
yeah, it's a lot.
When you're my age.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like for people to know about writing or your books or this book in particular, The Night Visitors?
Yeah. Well, I think The Night Visitors, I mean, again, I'm excited about this book. I'm excited for it to be out in the world. I think it has, what I've tried to do is to meld that, the psychological suspense, and that, it's a very fast-moving book, but I think it also addresses a really important social issue, and that's important to me. It's important to me to have my readers think about, what would they do if they were out on the road and had no place to go, and to think about that when they encounter people who are in very different life situations from them, and what kind of judgments we make when we encounter people in those situations, and understand that this could be yourself, this could be a sister or a friend, somebody you love. So to really think about extending our compassion and care towards people who are in vulnerable situations. I think it's really more important now than ever. So, not to be too preachy, but because the book I feel it's a mystery and suspenseful, and I think there are some funny parts, which is always important to me. I've realized recently, and this is something I had not realized, and so I was in part, this is the last bit of sort of writing realization I've had recently, because I often have students who talk about, like, how do you know which book to write, and do you sometimes realize you can't write that book? And for me, there's a sort of, there are a lot of things that come together for a book, but I have to, no matter how serious the content is, I have to see some light in it, and some of that is just the humor of the characters, and sometimes it's very dark humor. Maddie is making some jokes during periods where terrible things are happening, but that's actually kind of important to me, and to find that lightness and that to be able to laugh at moments when things look really bleak, and so I think that's important too. I always think I write about people who are going through really dark times, but who manage through maybe lending a helping hand towards somebody else, finding a way out of that darkness, finding a way towards light, by having compassion for each other. And that's all I think any of us are really trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for everything. I love the book. It's definitely a page turner, and loved talking to you today. So thank you for taking the time to speak with me about The Night Visitors.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you once again to my guest, Carol Goodman, for joining me to talk about not only The Night Visitors, especially The Night Visitors, as well as some of her other writings. But if you are interested in this book, which if you like thrillers, or if you like paranormal, or if you like a book that is nice and creepy, then you should definitely check this book out. You can enter to win a copy of it. It's very simple. All you have to do is go to the GSMC Book Review social media pages, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and comment on the post with this episode 147, interview with Carol Goodman. That's it. GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Those links are in the show notes, the description of this show, and just leave a comment. Please also like the pages, like the post, etc. Follow us, do all those good things. I would love that. It would really help me out. But if you want a copy of the book, then you have to leave a comment. So please do so, and I will be happy to send you a copy of the book if you are one of the winners. Again, thank you to Carol. Thank you, as always, to my readers, my listeners, your readers as well, or you wouldn't probably be listening to a book review podcast. But thank you so much. Hope you're having a great week, and I hope you will join me again for the next episode of the GSMC Book Review Podcast. In the meantime, have a great week, but also make some time to go out and get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.